Hey there, welcome back to another journey through time. Tonight we're diving into something that will make you question everything you think you know about being human. We're talking about the very first humans to walk this planet, the original pioneers who had no roadmap, no ancestors to learn from, no culture to inherit, just raw survival instinct and the terrifying beauty of being completely alone in an untamed world. Before you settle in, go ahead and hit that like button if you're ready for a story that'll change how you see your own existence. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see our community spanning the globe. Now dim those lights, maybe grab a warm drink, and let's step back into the shoes of our earliest ancestors together. Imagine waking up one morning with no memory of yesterday, no language to describe what you're feeling, no concept of what tomorrow might bring. You don't know fire exists. You've never seen a tool. You have no idea that other humans like you are scattered across distant landscapes, facing the same impossible challenges. You are functionally the first conscious being of your kind, and every single thing around you is a mystery wrapped in potential death. This was the reality for our earliest human ancestors roughly 200,000 years ago. Not the Hollywood version, with perfectly tanned cave people grunting around controlled fires, but something far more raw, far more desperate, and infinitely more remarkable. These weren't primitive brutes stumbling through the wilderness. They were us, with the same capacity for fear, wonder, love, and ingenuity that defines humanity today. They just happened to be figuring out existence from absolute zero. The world they inherited was nothing like the one we know. No cities dotted the horizon, no roads carved paths through the wilderness, no farms stretched across valleys. The entire planet was wild, untamed, and utterly indifferent to their survival. Every sunrise brought new dangers they couldn't anticipate. Every sunset meant another night of vulnerability they had to somehow navigate. These first humans lived in a reality where a single mistake, a moment of inattention, or just plain bad luck could end not just their own story, but potentially the entire future of human civilization. Picture this. You're standing on the African savanna, the birthplace of our species, and the landscape stretches endlessly in every direction. Tall grasses wave in the wind like an ocean of green and gold. Acacia trees dot the horizon, their thorny branches offering shade but also concealment for predators. The air shimmers with heat, and every shadow could hide something that sees you as lunch. You have no weapons except what you can fashion with your bare hands. No shelter except what you can build or find. No food except what you can hunt, gather, or scavenge before something else claims it. Your body is your only tool, and it's both your greatest asset and your most vulnerable weakness. You have opposable thumbs that can grip and manipulate objects with precision no other animal possesses. Your brain, though lacking any education or accumulated knowledge, burns with the same creative fire that would eventually build rockets and compose symphonies. But you're also slow compared to the predators around you. Your skin offers no protection against claws or fangs. You have no natural armor, no poisonous bite, no intimidating size to ward off threats. What you do have is something revolutionary, the ability to think beyond the immediate moment. While other animals react to hunger by searching for food, you can imagine tomorrow's hunger and plan accordingly. While other creatures flee from danger, you can envision potential threats and prepare defenses. This capacity for abstract thought, for imagining possibilities that don't yet exist, is what separates you from every other living thing on the planet. It's also what will either save your species or drive it extinct through overconfidence. The first challenge these early humans faced wasn't finding food or avoiding predators, though both were constant threats. The first challenge was learning to be human without any instruction manual. Every basic skill we take for granted, every piece of common knowledge that seems obvious, had to be discovered through trial and error. And error, in this context, often meant death. Take something as simple as knowing which plants are safe to eat. Today, we learn this from parents, books, or cultural knowledge passed down through generations. But the first humans had no such luxury. They had to learn by watching animals, by experimenting on themselves, by making mistakes and hoping those mistakes weren't fatal. Imagine the courage it took to try a new berry when you had no idea if it would nourish you or poison you. Imagine the desperate hunger that would drive someone to take that risk. Or consider the concept of cooking food. Fire wasn't something they could summon with the flick of a lighter or the strike of a match. Fire was a rare, precious phenomenon that occurred naturally through lightning strikes or volcanic activity. When these early humans first encountered fire, it was probably terrifying. A wall of heat and light that consumed everything in its path, turning green forests into ash and bone. Yet somewhere along the way, someone had to make the connection that this destructive force could also be controlled, tamed, and used to transform raw meat into something more digestible and nutritious. The first human to deliberately maintain a fire was taking an enormous risk. Fire was dangerous, unpredictable, and required constant attention. It could easily escape control and destroy everything you'd built, but it also provided warmth during cold nights, protection from nocturnal predators, and the ability to cook food that would otherwise be inedible or dangerous to consume. That first controlled fire represented a fundamental shift in human evolution, the moment we stopped being entirely at the mercy of our environment and began to shape it to our needs. But even before fire, these early humans were solving problems that would challenge modern survival experts. They were learning to track animals across vast distances, reading subtle signs in disturbed earth and broken vegetation that told stories of where prey had passed and when. They were developing the ability to predict weather patterns by observing cloud formations and animal behaviour. They were creating mental maps of their territory, remembering the locations of water sources, seasonal food supplies, and safe shelter spots across hundreds of square miles. Most remarkably, they were learning to cooperate in ways no other species had achieved. While other animals might hunt in packs or live in social groups, early humans developed something unprecedented: the ability to communicate complex ideas, to plan coordinated strategies, and to work together toward long-term goals that might not provide immediate benefits. This cooperation wasn't just about survival, though survival was certainly the driving force. It was about creating something entirely new in the natural world, a species that could share knowledge, build on each other's discoveries, and pass wisdom from one generation to the next. When one human figured out how to craft a more effective tool or identify a new food source, that knowledge didn't die with them. It spread to others, was refined and improved upon, and became part of the growing toolkit that defined human civilization. The social structures these first humans developed were unlike anything that had existed before. They weren't just following instinctual hierarchies like wolf packs or bee colonies. They were creating flexible, adaptive communities where different individuals could take leadership roles based on their skills and the specific challenges at hand. The best tracker might lead during hunts. The most knowledgeable about plant life might guide foraging expeditions. The strongest might serve as protectors during dangerous journeys. These early societies faced questions that still challenge us today. How do you balance individual needs against group survival? What happens when resources become scarce and difficult decisions must be made? How do you maintain cooperation when conflicts arise? How for the do you care weak, the injured, and the elderly when every member of the group must contribute to survival? The answers they developed weren't written in books or codified in laws. They were lived experiences, tested through countless trials and refined through generations of practice. Some groups undoubtedly made choices that led to their extinction. Others found combinations of strategies that allowed them to thrive and expand into new territories. The humans whose descendants eventually populated the entire planet were the ones who got these fundamental questions right. One of the most profound challenges these first humans faced was the concept of death and what it meant for their communities. Unlike other animals that might mourn briefly or show distress at the loss of a group member, early humans seemed to develop a deeper understanding of mortality and its implications. They began to care for their dead in ways that served no immediate survival purpose, but fulfilled some deeper psychological or spiritual need. The first human burial sites tell stories of communities that took time and energy to honour their deceased, even when such activities provided no practical benefit and potentially put the living at risk by remaining in one location longer than safety might dictate. These burial practices suggest that early humans were grappling with questions of meaning, purpose, and continuity that went beyond simple survival instincts. They were developing the capacity for abstract thought that would eventually lead to art, music, religion, and philosophy. But in those early days, these concepts existed only in primitive forms, expressed through actions rather than words, felt rather than articulated. The first human to place flowers on a grave or arrange stones in a meaningful pattern was taking a step towards something uniquely human, something that separated our species from all others on the planet. As these early communities grew and evolved, they faced new challenges that tested their adaptability and ingenuity. Climate changes forced them to migrate to new territories with different resources and hazards. Population growth meant that established territories could no longer support everyone, leading to difficult decisions about expansion and separation. Contact with other human groups introduced both opportunities for cooperation and trade, as well as potential conflicts over resources and territory. The first humans to venture beyond their known territories were explorers in the truest sense, walking into landscapes no human had ever seen, and animals they're encountering plant species had never faced, and adapting to climates and conditions that pushed their survival skills to the limit. They carried with them only what they could transport on foot, the accumulated knowledge of their communities and the unshakable human drive to discover what lay beyond the next horizon. These pioneering expeditions weren't casual weekend hikes. They were irreversible journeys into the unknown, often driven by necessity rather than curiosity. When drought dried up familiar water sources, or when game animals migrated beyond reach, entire communities had to make gut-wrenching decisions about whether to stay and risk starvation or venture into territories that might be even more hostile than what they were leaving behind. The psychological toll of these migrations was immense. Imagine leaving behind every landmark you'd ever known, every tree that had provided shelter, every stream that had quenched your thirst, every cave that had offered protection from storms. You're walking away from the graves of your ancestors, the places where your children took their first steps, the clearings where your community gathered to share stories under starlit skies. You're carrying the elderly and the young into landscapes that might kill them before you find new sources of life. Yet these migrations were also humanity's first great adventures. The first humans to cross mountain ranges saw vistas no eyes had ever beheld. They discovered valleys rich with unfamiliar fruits, encountered species of animals that existed nowhere else on Earth, and learned to adapt their survival strategies to completely new environments. Each successful migration expanded the boundaries of human possibility and proved that our species could thrive almost anywhere on the planet. The development of language among these early communities represents one of humanity's most remarkable achievements, though it happened so gradually that no single generation would have recognized the magnitude of what was occurring. The first words weren't grand pronouncements or philosophical statements. They were practical necessities, grunts and gestures that meant danger, food, water, or shelter. Simple sounds that could convey complex information quickly across distances or in situations where silence meant survival. But language evolved into something far more powerful than just a survival tool. It became the foundation for culture, the mechanism through which knowledge could be preserved and transmitted with unprecedented accuracy. The first human to use a word to describe something that wasn't immediately present, to talk about yesterday's hunt or tomorrow's journey, was crossing a threshold that separated our species from all others. Language allowed humans to live simultaneously in the past, present, and future in ways no other creature could achieve. With language came storytelling, and with storytelling came the ability to share experiences across time and space. The hunter who had faced down a dangerous predator could describe that encounter to others, allowing them to benefit from his experience without having to face the same risks. The gatherer who had discovered a new source of nutritious plants could teach others exactly where to find them and how to identify them correctly. These stories weren't just practical instructions, they were the beginning of human culture, the foundation upon which communities built shared identities and values. The first epic tales told around flickering fires weren't about gods and heroes, though they would eventually evolve into such narratives. They were about real people who had faced real challenges and either triumphed or failed, providing lessons that could guide future generations. The creation and refinement of tools marked another crucial milestone in early human development. The first tool was probably nothing more than a stick used to dig roots, or a stone used to crack nuts. But the human capacity to see potential in ordinary objects, to envision how natural materials could be modified to serve specific purposes, set our ancestors apart from every other species on Earth. Tool-making wasn't just about solving immediate problems. It required abstract thinking, the ability to imagine a desired outcome, and work backwards to determine what materials and techniques would be needed to achieve it. The first human to deliberately chip stone to create a sharp edge was engaging in a form of engineering, applying principles of physics and materials science without understanding the formal concepts behind them. Each improvement in tool technology opened up new possibilities for survival and expansion. Better cutting tools meant more efficient food preparation and the ability to work with tougher materials. Improved hunting implements increased the success rate of hunts and allowed communities to target larger, more dangerous prey. Enhanced digging tools made it possible to access underground water sources and extract roots and tubers that had previously been unreachable. The social implications of tool making were as significant as the practical benefits. Creating effective tools required skill, patience, and knowledge that had to be learned and practiced over time. This created a new form of specialization within communities where individuals who showed particular aptitude for crafting tools could focus their efforts on that activity while others concentrated on hunting, gathering, or childcare. The transmission of tool-making knowledge from one generation to the next represented humanity's first formal educational system. Master craftsmen teaching apprentices, parents showing children, experienced hunters passing on techniques to younger community members. This knowledge transfer wasn't casual or accidental. It was deliberate, systematic, and crucial for community survival. But perhaps the most profound challenge these first humans faced wasn't physical survival, or tool making, or even language development. It was learning to live with the weight of consciousness itself. Unlike other animals that lived primarily in the present moment, early humans were developing the capacity for self-reflection, for questioning their place in the world, for wondering about the meaning and purpose of their existence. This emerging consciousness brought both tremendous advantages and crushing psychological burdens. The ability to plan for the future and learn from the past made humans incredibly adaptable and successful as a species, but it also introduced concepts like regret, anxiety about unknown outcomes, and existential questioning that no other creatures experienced. The first human to truly understand that death was inevitable, that everyone they loved would eventually be gone, that their own existence was temporary and fragile, was grappling with philosophical questions that still challenge us today. How do you find meaning in a life that will inevitably end? How do you maintain hope and motivation when you understand the ultimate futility of all earthly endeavours? How do you build relationships and communities knowing that loss and separation are inevitable? These weren't abstract philosophical debates conducted in comfortable academic settings. They were immediate, pressing concerns that affected daily survival and community cohesion. Early humans had to develop coping mechanisms for psychological stress that went far beyond anything required for basic biological survival. They began creating rituals and ceremonies that served no practical purpose but fulfilled deep psychological needs. The first decorative objects, the earliest forms of art, the development of music and dance, all represented attempts to find meaning and beauty in a world that often seemed hostile and arbitrary. The creation of the first jewellery, carved figurines, or painted cave walls wasn't about vanity or entertainment. It was about asserting human significance in a vast, indifferent universe. It was about creating something that would outlast individual lifespans, something that would serve as evidence that humans had existed, had thought, had felt, had mattered. These artistic expressions also served important social functions, helping to bind communities together through shared symbols and experiences. The first ritual dances performed around fires weren't just entertainment. They were communal activities that reinforced group identity and solidarity. The first songs weren't casual melodies hummed during idle moments. They were memory devices that helped preserve important information about survival techniques, territorial boundaries, and community history. As these early human communities grew more sophisticated, they began to develop concepts of trade and exchange that went beyond simple sharing within family groups. The first inter-community trading relationships represented a revolution in human social organisation, creating connections between distant groups and establishing the foundations for economic systems that would eventually span continents. These early trade relationships weren't based on currency or formal contracts. They were built on trust, reciprocity, and mutual benefit. One community might have access to high-quality stone for toolmaking, while another had discovered rich hunting grounds. By establishing trading relationships, both communities could benefit from resources they couldn't access directly. The psychological and social skills required for successful trading were incredibly complex. Traders had to be able to communicate with people who spoke different languages, understand and respect different cultural practices, negotiate fair exchanges without formal legal frameworks, and maintain relationships across vast distances and long time periods. These trading expeditions were humanity's first diplomatic missions, requiring courage that went far beyond physical bravery. Imagine walking for weeks through unknown territory, carrying precious resources that represent your community's survival, approaching strangers who might see you as a threat rather than an opportunity. You have no common language beyond gestures and expressions. You have no legal system to enforce agreements. You have nothing but your ability to read human nature and hope that the universal desire for mutual benefit will overcome fear and suspicion. The first successful trade agreement communities was a between-distant human milestone, as significant as the invention of fire or the development of language. It proved that humans could cooperate across tribal boundaries, that shared interests could overcome cultural differences, and that the benefits of exchange could motivate people to take extraordinary risks. These early trading networks created the first threads in a web of human connection that would eventually span the entire globe. But success in trading required new forms of memory and record keeping that pushed human cognitive abilities to their limits. Traders had to remember complex agreements made months or years earlier. They had to track debts and credits across multiple communities. They had to maintain mental maps of the trading routes that might span hundreds of miles and involve dozens of different groups with varying customs and expectations. Some of these early traders began developing primitive systems for recording information. notched sticks that represented quantities of goods, arrangements of stones that marked territorial boundaries or indicated the locations of hidden supply caches, string and knot systems that could encode complex messages about trading opportunities or seasonal resource availability. These weren't writing systems in any formal sense, but they represented humanity's first attempts to create external memory storage, to preserve important information in forms that could survive beyond individual lifespans. The social status of successful traders within their communities was unique and complex. They were valuable because they brought back resources and information that couldn't be obtained any other way, but they were also potentially dangerous because they had extensive contact with outsiders and might bring back ideas or loyalties that could threaten community cohesion. The first traders were simultaneously the most cosmopolitan and the most suspect members of their societies. As these trading networks expanded, they began to facilitate the spread of innovations at unprecedented speed. A new tool design developed in one region could spread across vast distances within a few generations instead of taking centuries to diffuse gradually. Improved hunting techniques, better methods for food preservation, more effective shelter construction, all of these advances could leap across cultural and geographic boundaries through the connections maintained by traders. This acceleration of innovation created a feedback loop that drove human development at an ever-increasing pace. Communities that participated in trading networks gained access to the best ideas and technologies from multiple regions, giving them significant advantages over more isolated groups. The pressure to develop valuable trade goods encouraged specialization and experimentation, leading to rapid improvements in craftsmanship and resource utilization. The psychological impact of these expanding horizons was profound. Early humans were beginning to understand that their local community was part of a much larger world, populated by other people with different ways of life, but similar fundamental needs and desires. The first person to hear stories about distant lands with different climates, animals, and plants was experiencing a form of intellectual expansion that broadened human consciousness in ways that would have seemed impossible to their ancestors. Yet with these expanding connections came new forms of vulnerability and stress. Communities that had once been self-sufficient now depended on trading relationships that could be disrupted by weather, conflict, or simple misunderstandings. The failure of a trading expedition might mean the difference between prosperity and starvation. The breakdown of diplomatic relationships with neighboring groups could cut off access to essential resources and force communities to relocate or face extinction. The first humans to experience what we might recognize as political anxiety were those who understood that their community's survival depended on maintaining complex relationships with distant peoples over whom they had no direct control. They had to worry not just about immediate threats like predators and weather, but about abstract possibilities like the political stability of trading partners and the long-term sustainability of resource exchange agreements. These concerns drove the development of increasingly sophisticated forms of social organization within communities. Leaders emerged who specialized in maintaining external relationships rather than just managing internal affairs. Councils and decision-making bodies evolved to handle the complex negotiations required for successful trading partnerships. Conflict resolution mechanisms developed to address disputes that could threaten valuable alliances. The emergence of specialized leadership roles marked another crucial transition in human social evolution. The first chiefs who gain or held authority through their diplomatic skills, rather than their physical prowess, were establishing new criteria for social status and power. Success was no longer measured solely by individual survival skills, but by the ability to navigate complex social networks and maintain beneficial relationships across multiple communities. These early leaders faced challenges that would be familiar to modern politicians and diplomats. They had to balance competing interests within their own communities while negotiating with external partners who had different priorities and values. They had to make decisions based on incomplete information about distant events and changing circumstances. They had to maintain their authority and credibility even when their diplomatic efforts failed or produced unexpected consequences. The development of leadership hierarchies within communities created new sources of internal tension and conflict. Not everyone agreed with the decisions made by leaders, especially when those decisions involved significant risks or required personal sacrifices for uncertain future benefits. The first political dissent, the first challenges to established authority, the first debates about how communities should be governed, all emerged during this period of increasing social complexity. These internal conflicts weren't just disagreements about specific policies or decisions. They represented fundamental questions about human nature and social organization that still challenge us today. Should communities prioritize individual freedom or collective security? How much authority should leaders have? And how should that authority be limited or controlled? What obligations do individuals have to their communities? And what protections should communities provide to individuals? The resolution of these conflicts required new forms of communication and consensus building that went far beyond the simple cooperation needed for hunting or gathering. Early humans had to develop techniques for public debate, methods for reaching decisions when complete agreement was impossible, and mechanisms for enforcing community decisions, even when some members disagreed with them. The first community meetings where these issues were debated and resolved were humanity's earliest experiments in democratic governance. They weren't formal democratic institutions with written constitutions and established procedures, but they embodied the same fundamental principles that would eventually evolve into more sophisticated political systems. The recognition that community decisions should reflect the input of multiple members evaluated, and that different perspectives should be considered, and that authority should be exercised with the consent of the governed. These early democratic experiments were fragile and often unsuccessful. Many communities split apart when internal conflicts couldn't be resolved peacefully. Others fell under the control of authoritarian leaders who suppressed dissent and made unilateral decisions. The communities that survived and thrived were those that found effective ways to balance individual needs with collective requirements, to maintain unity while tolerating diversity of opinion, and to adapt their governance structures as circumstances changed. The psychological stress of living in these increasingly complex societies was unlike anything humans had experienced before. Individual survival now depended not just on personal skills and immediate family relationships, but on the health and stability of elaborate social networks involving dozens or hundreds of people. The first humans to experience what we might recognize as social anxiety were those who understood that their fate was tied to the decisions and actions of many others over whom they had little direct influence. This growing social complexity also created new opportunities for individual fulfillment and achievement. The first humans who gained recognition for their skills as negotiators, their wisdom as advisors, or their creativity as innovators were discovering that survival was no longer the only measure of human worth. Communities were beginning to value and reward abilities that went beyond basic survival skills, creating niches for individuals who might not have thrived in simpler, more physically demanding societies. The emergence of specialized roles within communities marked the beginning of human civilization in its truest sense. When some individuals could focus their efforts on tool-making, others on trading, others on leadership, and others on various forms of cultural expression, communities could achieve levels of sophistication and capability that would have been impossible when everyone had to be generalists focused primarily on basic survival. But specialization also created new forms of dependency and vulnerability. Communities became more efficient and capable, but also more fragile. The loss of key individuals with specialized knowledge could be catastrophic in ways that wouldn't have been true in simpler societies where everyone possessed similar basic survival skills. The first communities to experience the vulnerability that comes with interdependence were learning lessons about resilience and redundancy that would shape human social organization for millennia to come. The development of cultural traditions and customs served as a stabilizing force in these increasingly complex societies. Shared rituals, common stories, traditional practices, and established ways of doing things provided continuity and predictability in communities where rapid change and innovation were becoming constant features of daily life. The first cultural conservatives, those who argued for maintaining traditional ways even when new alternatives seemed more efficient, were serving an important function by preserving social stability and community identity. Yet the tension between tradition and innovation created ongoing conflicts that required constant negotiation and balance. Communities that were too resistant to change risked falling behind their neighbours in terms of technology, resource utilisation, and adaptation to changing circumstances. Communities that changed too rapidly risked losing their sense of identity and social cohesion. The first humans to grapple with the challenge of managing cultural evolution were pioneering techniques for social change that remain relevant today. The increasing complexity of human societies also created new opportunities for conflict and cooperation between different communities. As trading networks expanded and territories overlapped, neighbouring groups had to develop mechanisms for resolving disputes without resorting to violence that could destroy valuable relationships and resources. The first diplomatic protocols, the first peace treaties, the first attempts at international law all emerged from the practical necessity of managing intercommunity relationships in ways that maximised benefits while minimising risks. These early diplomatic efforts were remarkable for their sophistication and creativity. Without written language or formal legal systems, communities had to rely on verbal agreements, symbolic gestures, and ceremonial exchanges to create binding commitments between groups. The first peace ceremonies, where leaders from different communities came together to establish mutual understanding and cooperation, were creating precedents for international relations that would influence human political development for thousands of years. The success of these diplomatic initiatives depended heavily on the development of trust between communities that had different cultures, values, and interests. Building such trust required patience, consistency, and a willingness to make short-term sacrifices for long-term benefits. The first humans who dedicated their lives to maintaining peaceful relationships between potentially hostile communities were pioneers in one of humanity's most important and challenging endeavours. The establishment of these peaceful relationships between communities represented a fundamental shift in how humans understood their place in the world. For the first time in their species' history, they were beginning to see themselves not just as members of small, isolated groups struggling for survival, but as part of a larger human community with shared interests and common challenges. This expanding sense of identity would have profound implications for everything, from resource management to conflict resolution to the development of moral and ethical frameworks. But peace was fragile and required constant maintenance. The first peacekeeping missions, where representatives from allied communities travelled between groups to resolve disputes and maintain communication, were extraordinarily dangerous undertakings. These early diplomats had to traverse hostile territories, navigate complex cultural differences, and mediate conflicts where emotions ran high and the stakes were literally life and death. They possessed no formal authority beyond their ability to persuade, and no protection beyond the respect they had earned through previous successful interventions. The psychological profiles of these early peacekeepers were remarkable. They had to be simultaneously brave enough to travel alone through dangerous territories and diplomatic enough to diffuse tensions between angry, frightened people. They needed to understand multiple cultures and languages well enough to communicate effectively with diverse groups, yet maintain enough neutrality to be trusted by all parties. Most importantly, they had to believe deeply in the possibility of peaceful coexistence even when surrounded by evidence of human capacity for violence and betrayal. The failure of diplomatic missions could have catastrophic consequences that extended far beyond the immediate communities involved. When peaceful negotiations broke down, the resulting conflicts could destroy trading relationships, force population migrations, and create cycles of retaliation that lasted for generations. The first humans to experience what we might recognize as the tragedy of war were those who watched their carefully constructed networks of cooperation collapse into violence that benefited no one and left entire communities devastated. Yet even in the midst of conflict, early humans were developing concepts of justice and proportionality that would eventually evolve into formal legal systems. The first attempts to distinguish between justified and unjustified violence, between necessary self-defense and unprovoked aggression, between proportionate response and excessive retaliation, represented crucial steps in the development of human moral reasoning. These weren't abstract philosophical discussions, but immediate practical concerns that determined whether communities would survive or be destroyed. The establishment of rules for warfare, primitive though they may have been, marked another significant milestone in human social development. The first agreements about protecting non-combatants, respecting surrendering enemies, or limiting the scope of retaliation were creating precedents for the laws of war that would eventually become formalized in international treaties. Even in their most violent conflicts, early humans were demonstrating a capacity for restraint and moral reasoning that distinguished them from other species. The psychological impact of warfare on these early communities was devastating in ways that went far beyond the immediate physical casualties. The first humans to experience post-traumatic stress, survivor guilt, and the moral injury that comes from participating in or witnessing extreme violence were grappling with psychological wounds that their communities had no established mechanisms for healing. The development of rituals for warriors returning from battle, ceremonies for honoring the dead, and practices for reintegrating combatants into peaceful community life represented humanity's earliest attempts at what we would now recognize as psychological therapy. The need to care for wounded warriors and traumatized survivors also drove innovations in medical knowledge and healing practices. The first field hospitals, crude though they may have been, represented attempts to preserve human life and reduce suffering in circumstances where such efforts served no immediate survival advantage. The first battlefield surgeons, working with primitive tools and no understanding of infection or sterile technique, were pioneers in medical care whose efforts saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. These medical advances weren't limited to battlefield situations. As communities grew larger and more complex, they faced new health challenges that required innovative solutions. The first public health measures, designed to prevent the spread of disease in crowded settlements, represented early attempts at community medicine. The first quarantine procedures, primitive sanitation systems, and efforts to ensure clean water supplies were protecting entire communities rather than just individual patients. The development of specialized medical knowledge also created new social roles within communities. The first healers who dedicated their lives to understanding and treating illness were establishing a profession that would become central to human civilization. These early medical practitioners had to combine practical knowledge about herbs and wound care with psychological skills for comforting the sick and dying, and spiritual insights for helping communities cope with loss and suffering. The training and education of healers represented one of humanity's first formal knowledge preservation systems. Master healers teaching apprentices, experienced practitioners sharing their knowledge with younger colleagues, communities maintaining oral traditions about medicinal plants, and treatment techniques. This knowledge transfer was crucial not just for individual patient care, but for community survival during epidemics or other health crises. The emergence of spiritual and religious practices during this period reflected humanity's growing capacity for abstract thought and symbolic reasoning. The first shamans, priests, or spiritual leaders were addressing questions that went far beyond immediate survival concerns. They were helping their communities grapple with fundamental questions about the meaning of existence, the nature of death, the relationship between humans and the natural world, and the possibility of forces beyond immediate physical reality. These early religious practices weren't sophisticated theological systems with elaborate doctrines and formal institutions. They were practical responses to psychological and social needs that arose as human consciousness became more complex. The first burial rituals weren't based on detailed beliefs about afterlife or resurrection, but on the immediate need to deal with the emotional trauma of loss and the practical problem of disposing of bodies in ways that didn't threaten community health. The development of creation myths and origin stories served important psychological functions for communities trying to understand their place in a vast, often hostile world. The first storytellers who attempted to explain how the world came to be, why humans existed, and what their purpose might be, were providing frameworks for meaning that helped individuals and communities cope with the existential anxiety that came with increased consciousness and self-awareness. These early mythologies also served important social functions by providing shared narratives that bound communities together and distinguished them from neighbouring groups. The first cultural identities based on common stories, shared symbols, and collective rituals were creating forms of social cohesion that went beyond simple kinship relationships or immediate survival needs. Communities that shared strong cultural identities were often more successful in maintaining unity during difficult periods and more effective in coordinating complex collective activities. The creation of the first art objects, whether cave paintings, carved figurines, or decorated tools, represented another crucial milestone in human development. These weren't casual decorative activities, but serious attempts to create meaning, preserve important information, and express concepts that couldn't be communicated through ordinary language. The first artists were pioneers in symbolic communication, whose work served functions that were simultaneously practical, aesthetic, and spiritual. The techniques required for creating durable art objects pushed early humans to develop new skills in material manipulation and tool use. The first painters had to learn how to create pigments from natural materials, understand which surfaces would hold colour permanently, and develop methods for applying paint that would create recognizable images. The first sculptors had to master techniques for shaping stone, bone, and wood with primitive tools, while understanding the properties of different materials and how they would change over time. The social significance of artistic creation was as important as the technical achievements. The first communities that devoted time and resources to creating objects that served no immediate survival purpose were making profound statements about human values and priorities. They were asserting that beauty, meaning, and symbolic expression were worth preserving even when survival remained emergence of musical traditions uncertain and resources were scarce. They represented another form of artistic expression that served multiple functions within early communities. The first musicians weren't professional entertainers, but community members who discovered and psychological purposes important social that organised sound could serve. Music could coordinate group activities, preserve important information in memorable forms, provide emotional release during stressful periods, and create shared experiences that strengthened community bonds. The development of musical instruments required sophisticated understanding of acoustics, materials science, and craftsmanship. The first flute makers had to understand how the size and placement of holes affected pitch and tone, how different materials produced different sounds, and how to shape instruments that would be both durable and playable. These weren't casual experiments, but serious engineering projects that required planning, skill, and considerable investment of time and resources. The social functions of music extended far beyond entertainment or artistic expression. Musical performances often accompanied religious ceremonies, providing emotional enhancement for spiritual experiences. Work songs helped coordinate group labor activities, making collective tasks more efficient and enjoyable. Lullabies and children's songs served educational functions, helping young community members learn important information about survival skills, cultural values, and social expectations. The first dance traditions were closely connected to musical development, but served additional functions related to physical fitness, social bonding, and cultural expression. Community dances weren't casual social activities, but important rituals that reinforced group identity, celebrated significant events, and provided outlets for emotional expression that strengthened social cohesion. The first choreographers were creating structured movement patterns that could be learned, remembered, and passed down through generations. The physical demands of dance also contributed to community health and fitness in ways that served practical survival purposes. Communities that maintained dance traditions often had members who were more physically capable, better coordinated, and more accustomed to moving in synchronized groups. These advantages could be crucial during hunting expeditions, defensive actions, or long migrations where physical stamina and group coordination were essential for success. The development of competitive activities and games represented another important aspect of early human social development. The first sporting competitions weren't casual entertainment, but serious training exercises that helped community members develop skills needed for survival while providing safe outlets for competitive instincts that might otherwise lead to destructive conflicts. Wrestling matches, running races, and accuracy contests with projectile weapons all served dual purposes as both recreation and practical skill development. These competitive activities also served important social functions by providing mechanisms for establishing status hierarchies without resorting to violence. Young community members could demonstrate their capabilities and earn respect through athletic achievement rather than through dangerous confrontations. Older members could maintain their social standing by serving as judges, coaches, or organisers even when their physical abilities declined. The rules and procedures that governed these early competitions represented humanity's first attempts at creating formal systems for fair play and dispute resolution. The first referees and judges were establishing principles for impartial decision-making that would eventually influence legal systems and governance structures. The first sports regulations were experiments in creating agreed-upon standards for behaviour that could be applied consistently across different situations and individuals. The psychological benefits of competitive activities were as important as their physical and social functions. Participation in games and contests provided healthy outlets for aggression, opportunities for personal achievement, and experiences of both victory and defeat that helped individuals develop emotional resilience. Communities that maintained strong traditions of competitive activities often had members who were better equipped to handle the psychological stresses of survival in challenging environments. The emergence of specialized roles within competitive activities also contributed to community development in unexpected ways. The first coaches were developing systematic approaches to skill development and performance improvement. The first equipment makers were creating specialized tools designed specifically for recreational rather than survival purposes. The first event organizers were learning to coordinate complex group activities that required careful planning and resource management. These developments in recreational and competitive activities reflected the growing sophistication of early human communities and their increasing to devote time and energy to pursuits that went beyond immediate survival needs. The fact that these communities could support members whose primary contributions were in areas like entertainment, athletic instruction, or artistic creation indicated that their basic survival strategies had become successful enough to allow for specialization and cultural development. The seasonal cycles that governed early human life created natural rhythms for community activities and social development. The first seasonal festivals and celebrations weren't arbitrary social events, but carefully timed activities that served important psychological and practical functions. Winter gatherings provided opportunities for sharing stored resources, maintaining social bonds during periods of enforced proximity, and planning for the challenges of the coming year. Spring celebrations marked the renewal of life and the beginning of new agricultural and foraging cycles. These weren't just parties, but community-wide coordinated efforts to ensure that everyone understood their roles in the upcoming season's survival activities. The first spring festivals were combining religious observance, practical planning, social bonding, and psychological preparation for the intense work periods ahead. Summer activities focused on the urgent tasks of resource gathering, food preservation, and territorial maintenance that would determine community survival through the following winter. But even during these busy periods, early humans found time for social activities that maintained community cohesion and provided relief from the stresses of constant work. The first summer gatherings were balancing practical necessity with social and psychological needs. Autumn preparations involved not just the practical tasks of food preservation and shelter maintenance, but also the psychological preparation for the isolation and hardship of winter. The first harvest festivals were combining celebration of successful resource gathering with solemn recognition of the challenges ahead and renewed commitment to mutual support during difficult times. These seasonal rhythms created natural cycles of community activity that helped early humans manage the psychological and social stresses of survival in challenging environments. Communities that developed strong seasonal traditions often had better survival rates because these traditions helped maintain social cohesion, coordinate essential activities, and provide psychological support during the most difficult periods of the year. The development of long-term planning capabilities represented another crucial advancement in early human cognitive development. The first communities that began making preparations for events that might occur years in the future were demonstrating abstract thinking abilities that distinguished them from other species and gave them significant survival advantages. Planning for multi-year droughts, preparing for population growth, or anticipating the need for territorial expansion required cognitive skills that went far beyond immediate problem solving. These long-term planning efforts also required new forms of social organization and decision-making. Communities had to develop mechanisms for making collective commitments that would bind future generations, for allocating current resources toward uncertain future benefits, and for maintaining continuity of purpose across changes in leadership and membership. The first long-term community projects were experiments in social cooperation that tested human capacity for sustained collective action. The psychological challenges of long-term planning were as significant as the practical and social challenges. Individuals had to develop the ability to make personal sacrifices for benefits they might never live to see, to maintain motivation for projects that would take decades to complete, and to pass on commitments and responsibilities to younger community members who hadn't participated in the original decision-making processes. The success of these long-term planning efforts created positive feedback loops that encouraged even more ambitious projects and longer planning horizons. Communities that successfully completed multi-generational projects gained confidence in their ability to shape their future circumstances rather than simply reacting to immediate challenges. This growing sense of human agency and control over environmental factors would eventually lead to some of humanity's greatest achievements and most dangerous overreaches. The development of memory preservation techniques became crucial as communities accumulated more knowledge and experience that needed to be transmitted across generations. The first formal educational systems weren't schools with buildings and curricula, but structured approaches to ensuring that essential knowledge wouldn't be lost when older community members died. Master craftsmen teaching apprentices, experienced hunters training younger colleagues, elders passing on historical knowledge to children, all represented systematic efforts at knowledge preservation. These educational efforts required sophisticated understanding of human learning and memory. The first teachers had to develop techniques for presenting complex information in ways that could be easily remembered and accurately transmitted. They had to understand how to motivate learners, how to assess comprehension, and how to correct errors before they became embedded in community knowledge systems. The creation of memory aids and learning tools represented another form of technological innovation that served crucial social functions. The first teaching stories weren't casual entertainment, but carefully crafted narratives designed to embed important survival information in memorable formats. The first training exercises weren't arbitrary activities, but systematic approaches to skill development that had been refined through generations of experience. The psychological and social dynamics of these early educational systems were complex and sometimes problematic. Students had to balance respect for traditional knowledge with recognition that circumstances might require adaptation and innovation. Teachers had to maintain their authority while remaining open to new discoveries and changing conditions. Communities had to preserve essential knowledge while remaining flexible enough to adapt to new challenges and opportunities. The emergence of formal educational roles within communities created new forms of social status and responsibility. The first teachers were establishing a profession that would become central to human civilization, but they were also taking on obligations that extended far beyond their immediate families or survival needs. The success or failure of their educational efforts could determine whether entire communities would thrive or collapse when faced with new challenges. These developments in education and knowledge preservation were closely connected to the growing complexity of human technology and social organization. As communities developed more sophisticated tools, techniques, and social structures, the amount of knowledge required for successful participation in community life increased dramatically. The first humans to recognize that survival now required formal education rather than just learning through observation and imitation were identifying a fundamental shift in human development. The creation of the first schools, whether formal institutions or simply designated times and places for teaching activities, represented community recognition that education was too important to be left to chance or individual initiative. These weren't casual learning opportunities, but systematic efforts to ensure that all community members acquired the knowledge and skills necessary for both individual survival and community success. The psychological impact of formal education on early human communities was profound and far-reaching. Children who grew up in societies with structured learning systems developed cognitive abilities and social skills that were markedly different from those who learned purely through informal observation and imitation. The first generation to experience systematic education was developing enhanced memory capabilities, improved abstract reasoning skills, and more sophisticated understanding of complex relationships between different types of knowledge. These educational advances also created new forms of social stratification within communities. Individuals who demonstrated exceptional learning abilities or who mastered particularly valuable skills often gained elevated status that wasn't based on physical strength, family connections, or age. The first academic achievers, if we can call them that, were establishing new pathways to social recognition and community influence that would eventually transform human societies in fundamental ways. The relationship between teachers and students in these early educational systems was unlike anything that had existed before in human social organization. Teachers had to exercise authority over individuals who weren't their biological offspring, while students had to accept instruction from adults who weren't their parents. These relationships required new forms of trust, respect, and social bonding that extended beyond immediate family structures and created community-wide networks of mutual obligation and support. The development of specialized knowledge domains within communities led to the emergence of what we might recognize as the first professional guilds or craft associations. Master toolmakers, expert hunters, skilled healers, and experienced traders began forming informal groups that shared advanced techniques, maintained quality standards, and controlled access to specialized knowledge. These early professional organizations weren't formal institutions with written rules and membership requirements, but they served many of the same functions that would later be formalized in guild systems. The competition between different knowledge specialists sometimes created tensions within communities, especially when resources were scarce or when different approaches to solving problems came into conflict. The first professional rivalries weren't casual disagreements, but serious disputes that could affect community survival. When expert hunters disagreed about the best strategies for a crucial hunt, or when skilled healers recommended different treatments for a deadly illness, communities had to develop mechanisms for resolving conflicts between equally qualified authorities. These conflicts between specialists also drove innovation and improvement in ways that benefited entire communities. When different experts competed to demonstrate the effectiveness of their approaches, the resulting experimentation and refinement often led to significant advances in technology and technique. The first scientific method, though it wouldn't be recognized as such, emerged from these competitive dynamics between knowledgeable individuals trying to prove the superiority of their approaches. The emergence of innovation as a deliberate community activity, rather than just accidental discovery, marked another crucial transition in human development. The first research and development efforts weren't formal programs with dedicated funding and systematic procedures, but they represented conscious attempts to improve existing technologies and develop new solutions to recognized problems. Communities began allocating time and resources specifically for experimentation and innovation rather than just immediate survival activities. These early innovation efforts required new forms of risk management and resource allocation. Experimental projects might consume valuable materials without producing useful results. Innovative techniques might fail catastrophically at critical moments. Communities had to develop strategies for supporting innovation while protecting themselves from the potential negative consequences of failed experiments. The psychological profiles of the first innovators were remarkable for their combination of creativity, persistence, and willingness to challenge established practices. These individuals had to be confident enough in their ideas to risk community disapproval or resource waste, yet realistic enough to abandon unsuccessful approaches before they caused serious harm. They needed to balance respect for traditional knowledge with recognition that circumstances might require new solutions. The social dynamics surrounding innovation were complex and often contentious. Communities that were too conservative risked falling behind their neighbours in terms of technology and capability. Communities that were too willing to abandon proven methods for untested alternatives risked catastrophic failures during critical survival situations. The first innovation policies, informal though they may have been, represented attempts to balance these competing concerns. The development of quality control systems for new technologies and techniques became essential as innovation accelerated. The first testing procedures weren't formal scientific protocols, but systematic approaches to evaluating new ideas before implementing them in situations where failure could be fatal. Master craftsmen testing new tool designs, experienced hunters evaluating improved hunting strategies, skilled healers experimenting with alternative treatments. All were developing methods for assessing innovation that would eventually evolve into more sophisticated evaluation systems. The creation of knowledge storage systems beyond human memory became increasingly important as communities accumulated more information than individuals could reliably remember and transmit. The first external memory systems weren't writing in any formal sense, but they represented attempts to preserve important information in forms that could survive beyond individual lifespans and be accessed by multiple community members. Notched sticks that recorded seasonal patterns, arranged stones that marked territorial boundaries, knotted strings that encoded complex messages about resource locations or trading agreements, all represented early experiments in information storage and retrieval. These systems weren't sophisticated by modern standards, but they served crucial functions in communities where the loss of key information could mean the difference between survival and extinction. The individuals who specialized in maintaining these information systems were among the first librarians or record keepers, though they wouldn't have recognized those terms. Their responsibilities extended far beyond simply storing information to include interpreting complex records, updating information as circumstances changed, and ensuring that essential knowledge remained accessible to community members who needed it. The social significance of external information storage was enormous. Communities that developed effective record-keeping systems could maintain more complex trading relationships, coordinate more sophisticated group activities, and preserve more detailed knowledge about seasonal patterns and resource availability. These advantages often translated directly into improved survival rates and expanded territorial control. The psychological impact of external memory systems was equally significant. Individuals no longer had to carry the full burden of remembering all essential community knowledge, freeing mental resources for other cognitive activities. The first people to experience the relief of knowing that important information was safely stored outside their own memory were discovering new possibilities for intellectual development and creative thinking. But external information systems also created new vulnerabilities and dependencies. Communities that relied heavily on stored information faced catastrophic losses when records were destroyed by fire, flood, or enemy action. The first information security concerns weren't about digital privacy or cyber attacks, but they involved the same fundamental challenges of protecting valuable data from loss or unauthorized access. The development of redundant information storage systems represented early recognition of these vulnerabilities. Communities began maintaining multiple copies of essential records, storing information in different locations, and training multiple individuals in the skills needed to interpret and maintain complex record-keeping systems. These early backup procedures were crucial for ensuring continuity of community knowledge across generations and through various disasters. The emergence of long-distance communication systems allowed communities to share information and coordinate activities across much larger geographical areas than had previously been possible. The first message relay systems weren't sophisticated telecommunications networks, but they represented systematic attempts to transmit important information rapidly across distances that would otherwise require weeks or months of travel. Smoke signals, drum patterns, and arranged stone markers all served as early communication technologies that allowed communities to warn each other of dangers, coordinate hunting or trading activities, and maintain social connections across vast territories. These communication systems weren't reliable by modern standards, but they provided crucial advantages to communities that mastered their use. The individuals who specialized in operating these communication systems were among the first telecommunications workers responsible for maintaining signal stations, interpreting complex message codes, and ensuring that important communications reached their intended recipients. Their skills were essential for community survival and prosperity. But their work also required them to travel frequently through dangerous territories and maintain relationships with distant communities. The development of standardized communication protocols became essential as these networks expanded. Different communities had to agree on common signal meanings, message formats, and relay procedures if they wanted to participate in long-distance communication networks. The first telecommunications standards weren't formal technical specifications, but they represented crucial agreements that enabled cooperation across cultural and linguistic boundaries. The psychological and social effects of long-distance communication were profound. Communities that could communicate rapidly with distant allies felt more secure and confident in their ability to respond to threats or opportunities. Individuals who specialized in communication work developed broader perspectives on regional politics and economics, often serving as informal advisors to community leaders on matters involving external relationships. The strategic implications of communication advantages were enormous. Communities with superior communication systems could coordinate defensive actions more effectively, respond more quickly to trading opportunities, and maintain stronger alliances with distant partners. These advantages often translated into significant improvements in security, prosperity, and territorial control. The emergence of information warfare represented a darker aspect of communication system development. The first attempts at intercepting enemy communications, spreading disinformation, or disrupting rival communication networks weren't sophisticated intelligence operations, but they represented recognition that information control could be as important as physical force in conflicts between communities. The development of communication security measures became essential as communities recognized the vulnerabilities created by their dependence on information networks. The first encryption systems weren't complex mathematical algorithms, but they involved techniques for encoding sensitive messages in ways that would be meaningless to unauthorized recipients while remaining interpretable by intended audiences. The psychological stress of maintaining communication security was significant for individuals responsible for handling sensitive information. They had to balance the need for rapid information transmission with the requirements of security and discretion. The first communication security officers weren't formal intelligence professionals, but they faced many of the same challenges that would later be formalized in military and diplomatic organizations. The social dynamics of information control within communities became increasingly complex as communication systems expanded. Leaders had to decide what information should be shared broadly within communities, what should be restricted to specialists or decision makers, and what should be kept completely secret for security reasons. These decisions had significant implications for community cohesion, individual autonomy, and democratic participation in governance. The emergence of information hierarchies within communities created new forms of social stratification based on access to knowledge rather than physical capabilities or family connections. Individuals who had access to sensitive information about trading opportunities, security threats, or resource availability often gained significant influence over community decisions even if they held no formal leadership positions. The development of information ethics became necessary as communities grappled with questions about the responsible use of communication systems and stored knowledge. The first privacy concerns weren't about digital surveillance or data collection, but they involved fundamental questions about individual autonomy, community security, and the appropriate limits of information sharing. The psychological impact of information overload began to emerge as communities developed more sophisticated systems for collecting, storing, and transmitting knowledge. The first individuals to experience what we might recognize as analysis paralysis were those responsible for making decisions based on unprecedented amounts of complex, sometimes contradictory information from multiple sources. the development of information filtering and analysis techniques became essential for managing these cognitive challenges. The first intelligence analysts weren't professional researchers with advanced degrees, but they were individuals who specialized in making sense of large amounts of diverse information and presenting actionable conclusions to community decision-makers. The social significance of information analysis capabilities was enormous. Communities that could effectively process and interpret complex information had significant advantages in everything from resource management to conflict resolution to long-term planning. These analytical capabilities often determined which communities would thrive and which would struggle or fail when faced with complex challenges. The emergence of specialized analytical roles within communities created new career paths and social positions that were based primarily on cognitive rather than physical capabilities. The first information specialists were establishing professions that would eventually become central to human civilization. But they were also taking on responsibilities that extended far beyond their immediate survival needs. The development of decision-making processes that could effectively utilize complex information became crucial as communities faced increasingly sophisticated challenges. The first systematic approaches to policy analysis weren't formal procedures with written protocols, but they represented attempts to ensure that important decisions were based on the best available information rather than just intuition or tradition. The psychological challenges of information-based decision-making were significant for community leaders who had to balance multiple sources of often contradictory advice while taking responsibility for outcomes that could affect the survival of entire communities. The first executive stress wasn't about corporate performance or political approval ratings, but it involved the same fundamental challenges of making crucial decisions under conditions of uncertainty and incomplete information. The social dynamics of information-based governance created new tensions between traditional authority structures and emerging knowledge-based power systems. Leaders who had gained their positions through physical prowess, family connections, or religious authority sometimes found their decisions challenged by specialists who claimed superior knowledge about technical or strategic issues. The resolution of these conflicts between different sources of authority required new approaches to governance and decision-making that could effectively integrate traditional wisdom with specialized knowledge. The first attempts at evidence-based policymaking weren't sophisticated analytical frameworks, but they represented recognition that effective governance required both respect for established practices and willingness to adapt to new information and changing circumstances. The development of accountability systems for information-based decisions became essential as communities recognized the potential consequences of poor analysis or faulty reasoning. The first quality control procedures for decision-making weren't formal review processes, but they involved systematic attempts to evaluate the accuracy of predictions, assess the effectiveness of policies, and learn from both successful and unsuccessful decisions. The psychological and social pressures on individuals responsible for providing information and analysis to decision-makers were enormous. Their advice could determine whether communities prospered or failed, whether conflicts escalated or were resolved peacefully, whether resources were used effectively or wasted on unsuccessful projects. The first professional advisors weren't paid consultants with formal credentials, but they faced many of the same ethical and practical challenges that would later be formalized in professional standards and codes of conduct. The emergence of competing schools of thought within analytical disciplines created new forms of intellectual debate and academic conflict within communities. When different experts reached contradictory conclusions about the same information, communities had to develop mechanisms for resolving these disputes and deciding which analytical approaches to trust and follow. These intellectual conflicts weren't abstract academic debates, but immediate practical concerns that could affect community survival and prosperity. The first scientific controversies weren't conducted in journals or conferences, but in community meetings where the stakes were measured in terms of lives saved or lost rather than professional reputations or theoretical understanding. The development of methods for testing and validating different analytical approaches became crucial as communities recognized the importance of distinguishing between accurate and inaccurate information processing techniques. The first empirical testing procedures weren't controlled laboratory experiments, but they represented systematic attempts to evaluate the effectiveness of different approaches to problem solving and decision making. The social and psychological dynamics of these validation processes were complex and sometimes contentious. Experts whose approaches were proven ineffective faced not just professional embarrassment, but potential loss of status and influence within their communities. Communities had to balance respect for individual expertise with recognition that even knowledgeable specialists could be wrong about important issues. The emergence of collaborative analytical approaches represented recognition that complex challenges often required multiple perspectives and diverse forms of expertise. The first interdisciplinary teams weren't formal research groups with defined roles and procedures, but they involved systematic attempts to combine different types of knowledge and analytical approaches to address problems that couldn't be solved by any single specialist. The coordination challenges involved in these collaborative efforts were significant. Different specialists often had incompatible approaches to problem solving, conflicting priorities about what information was most important, and disagreements about how decisions should be made when expert opinions diverged. The first project management techniques weren't sophisticated organizational frameworks, but they represented practical approaches to coordinating complex group efforts. The development of communication systems that could effectively support collaborative analysis became essential as communities recognized the benefits of combining different forms of expertise. The first information sharing protocols weren't formal procedures with written guidelines, but they involved systematic approaches to ensuring that all relevant specialists had access to the information they needed while maintaining appropriate security and confidentiality. The psychological challenges of collaborative work were as significant as the practical and technical challenges. Specialists who were accustomed to working independently had to learn to share credit for successes, accept responsibility for group failures, and subordinate their individual preferences to collective decisions. The first team players weren't professional athletes, but knowledge workers, learning to balance individual expertise with group effectiveness. The social dynamics of collaborative analytical work created new forms of professional relationship that extended beyond traditional family, tribal, or hierarchical structures. The first professional partnerships weren't formal business arrangements, but collaborative relationships based on mutual respect for complementary expertise and shared commitment to effective problem solving. The emergence of standards for collaborative work became necessary as these partnerships expanded and became more complex. Communities had to develop expectations about professional behavior, quality standards for analytical work, and procedures for resolving conflicts between collaborating specialists. The first professional ethics weren't formal codes of conduct, but practical agreements about appropriate behavior in collaborative analytical work. The development of training programs for collaborative analytical skills represented recognition that effective teamwork required specific capabilities that weren't automatically acquired through individual expertise development. The first team training programs weren't formal educational curricula, but systematic approaches to helping specialists develop the communication, coordination, and conflict resolution skills needed for effective collaborative work. The psychological and social benefits of collaborative analytical approaches often extended far beyond the immediate problem-solving advantages. Specialists who worked effectively in collaborative teams often developed broader perspectives on complex issues, enhanced communication skills, and stronger professional networks that benefited both their individual careers and their community's analytical capabilities. The emergence of competitive dynamics between different collaborative teams created new incentives for innovation and excellence in analytical work. When multiple groups were working on similar problems, the resulting competition often drove improvements in methodology, accuracy, and efficiency that benefited entire communities rather than just individual specialists or teams. The development of fair competition systems for analytical work became important as communities recognized both the benefits and potential dangers of competitive dynamics. The first research competitions weren't formal contests with prizes and recognition ceremonies, but they involved systematic approaches to encouraging innovation while preventing destructive conflicts between competing specialists or teams. The social implications of competitive analytical work were complex and sometimes problematic. Communities had to balance the benefits of competition-driven innovation with the need for cooperation and information sharing on issues that affected collective survival. The first policies for managing competitive collaboration weren't written regulations, but practical agreements about appropriate behaviour in situations where individual success and community welfare might conflict. The psychological pressures on individuals and teams engaged in competitive analytical work were significant. The first performance anxiety in intellectual work wasn't about academic grades or professional advancement, but about the life and death consequences of analytical accuracy in communities where mistakes could lead to starvation, military defeat, or environmental catastrophe. The development of support systems for individuals and teams under competitive pressure became essential as communities recognized the psychological costs of high-stakes analytical work. The first stress management techniques for knowledge workers weren't formal therapy programs, but practical approaches to helping specialists maintain their effectiveness while managing the emotional demands of their responsibilities. The emergence of recognition and reward systems for analytical excellence represented community acknowledgement that intellectual contributions were as valuable as physical achievements in ensuring collective survival and prosperity. The first academic honours weren't formal degrees or titles, but community recognition for individuals whose analytical work had made significant contributions to collective welfare. The social dynamics of recognition systems for intellectual achievement created new hierarchies within communities that were based on cognitive rather than physical capabilities. The first knowledge-based starter systems weren't formal academic rankings, but practical acknowledgements that some individuals possessed analytical skills that were crucial for community survival. These recognition systems had to balance individual achievement with collective welfare, ensuring that intellectual excellence was rewarded without creating destructive competition or social fragmentation. The psychological impact of intellectual recognition on early human communities was profound and far-reaching. Individuals who gained status through analytical contributions often developed enhanced confidence in their cognitive abilities, leading to even greater innovation and problem-solving effectiveness. But this recognition also created pressure to maintain high performance levels and anxiety about potential failure in high-stakes situations where entire communities depended on their expertise. The development of mentorship systems for analytical skills became essential as communities recognized that intellectual capabilities could be developed and enhanced through structured learning relationships. The first academic mentors weren't formal professors with advanced degrees, but experienced analysts who took responsibility for developing the capabilities of younger community members with promising intellectual potential. These mentorship relationships required new forms of social bonding that went beyond traditional family or tribal connections. Mentors had to invest significant time and energy in developing other people's capabilities without immediate personal benefit, while students had to accept guidance and criticism from individuals who weren't their biological relatives. The first academic relationships were creating new forms of social structure that would eventually become central to human educational systems. The emergence of intellectual traditions within communities represented attempts to preserve and transmit analytical methodologies across generations. The first schools of thought weren't formal academic institutions, but informal networks of individuals who shared similar approaches to problem solving and analysis. These intellectual traditions provided continuity and coherence to analytical work, while also creating potential rigidity that could inhibit innovation and adaptation. The competition between different intellectual traditions often drove methodological innovation as proponents of different approaches attempted to demonstrate the superiority of their analytical techniques. When communities faced complex challenges that required analytical solutions, competing schools of thought would propose different strategies, and the relative success of these approaches would influence which methodologies gained acceptance and which were abandoned. The social tensions created by competing intellectual traditions were sometimes as significant as the analytical benefits they produced. Communities had to develop mechanisms for managing disagreements between proponents of different approaches while maintaining enough unity to function effectively. The first academic politics weren't about university departments or research funding, but about life and death decisions regarding which analytical approaches communities would adopt for crucial survival challenges. The development of synthesis techniques that could combine insights from different intellectual traditions represented recognition that complex problems often required multiple analytical perspectives. The first interdisciplinary approaches weren't formal academic programs, but practical attempts to integrate different methodologies when no single approach was sufficient to address challenging situations. The psychological challenges of intellectual synthesis work were significant for individuals who had to master multiple analytical approaches and develop the cognitive flexibility needed to switch between different methodological frameworks, depending on situational requirements. The first intellectual generalists weren't academic administrators, but specialists who could work effectively across different analytical domains. The emergence of meta-analytical capabilities within communities represented another level of intellectual sophistication that distinguished early human societies from other species. The first individuals who could analyze analytical processes themselves, evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of different methodological approaches, were developing cognitive capabilities that would eventually become central to scientific and philosophical development. These meta-analytical skills required abstract thinking abilities that went far beyond immediate problem solving to encompass systematic evaluation of thinking processes themselves. The first methodological critics weren't formal philosophers, but practical analysts who recognized that the quality of analytical approaches could be as important as the accuracy of specific conclusions. The development of standards for meta-analytical work became essential as communities recognized the importance of evaluating their own thinking processes. The first quality control systems for analytical methods weren't formal peer review procedures, but systematic approaches to ensuring that methodological approaches were appropriate for specific types of problems and circumstances. The social implications of meta-analytical capabilities were enormous because they allowed communities to improve their problem-solving effectiveness systematically rather than just accumulating more information or developing more specialized expertise. Communities that could effectively evaluate and improve their own analytical processes had significant advantages over those that relied solely on traditional approaches or individual expertise. The psychological demands of meta-analytical work were intense because individuals had to maintain awareness of both the specific problems they were analyzing and the analytical processes they were using to address those problems. The first cognitive multitaskers weren't modern knowledge workers, but early human analysts learning to manage multiple levels of intellectual activity simultaneously. The emergence of teaching systems for meta-analytical skills represented recognition that these capabilities were too important to develop through informal learning alone. The first methodology courses weren't formal academic classes, but systematic approaches to helping individuals develop the cognitive flexibility and analytical sophistication needed for effective meta-analytical work. The development of innovation systems within communities marked another crucial transition in early human intellectual development. The first research and development programs weren't formal institutional arrangements, but systematic community efforts to encourage and support the development of new analytical approaches, technologies, and problem-solving techniques. These innovation systems had to balance support for creativity and experimentation with protection against the risks associated with unproven approaches. Communities that were too conservative missed opportunities for improvement and advancement, while communities that were too willing to adopt untested innovations risked catastrophic failures during critical situations. The social dynamics of innovation systems were complex because they required communities to allocate resources toward uncertain future benefits, while maintaining support for proven approaches that ensured immediate survival. The first innovation policies weren't written documents, but practical agreements about how much risk communities were willing to accept in pursuit of potential improvements. The psychological profiles of successful innovators were remarkable for their combination of creativity, persistence, and practical judgment. These individuals had to be willing to challenge grounded enough established approaches, while remaining to recognize when their innovations weren't working. They needed confidence in their creative abilities combined with humility about the tested approaches. The emergence of innovation limitations of UNT support systems represented community recognition that creativity and experimentation required different types of resources and encouragement than traditional analytical work. The first research grants weren't formal funding programs, but community agreements to provide innovators with the time, materials, and protection from immediate survival pressures that they needed to pursue experimental approaches. The development of evaluation systems for innovations became crucial as communities accumulated experience with both successful and failed experimental approaches. The first technology assessment procedures weren't sophisticated analysis frameworks, but practical methods for determining when innovations were ready for broader implementation and when they should be abandoned or modified. The social tensions between innovation and tradition created ongoing challenges for communities that had to balance respect for proven approaches with openness to potentially beneficial changes. The first innovation policies had to address questions about how much change communities could absorb without losing their identity and stability, while ensuring that they didn't become too rigid to adapt to changing circumstances. The psychological impact of innovation systems on community members was significant because they created new opportunities for individual achievement and recognition, while also generating anxiety about potential changes to familiar ways of life. The first change management challenges weren't about corporate reorganization, but about helping communities adapt to beneficial innovations without losing social cohesion. The emergence of systematic approaches to innovation diffusion represented recognition that good ideas weren't automatically adopted even when their benefits were clear. Communities had to develop techniques for introducing innovations gradually, training people in new approaches and managing the transition periods during which both old and new methods might be used simultaneously. The development of innovation networks between communities allowed successful innovations to spread more rapidly across larger geographical areas than would have been possible through casual contact or migration alone. The first technology transfer programs weren't formal institutional arrangements, but systematic efforts to share beneficial innovations with allied communities while protecting competitive advantages when necessary. The social implications of innovation networks were enormous because they allowed communities to benefit from creative developments that originated far beyond their immediate territories. Communities that participated effectively in innovation networks could access the best ideas and technologies from multiple regions, giving them significant advantages over more isolated groups. The psychological challenges of managing innovation networks were significant for individuals responsible for evaluating external innovations and determining which ones were appropriate for local adoption. These technology scouts had to understand both the capabilities and limitations of their own communities and the potential benefits and risks of innovations developed under different circumstances. The emergence of intellectual property concepts within and between communities represented attempts to balance the benefits of innovation sharing with the need to provide incentives for continued creative development. The first patent systems weren't formal legal frameworks, but practical agreements about how innovators would be recognized and rewarded for their contributions while ensuring that beneficial innovations could spread to communities that needed them. The development of trade systems for intellectual innovations created new forms of economic exchange that went beyond physical goods to encompass ideas, techniques, and analytical approaches. The first knowledge markets weren't formal institutions but practical arrangements for exchanging valuable intellectual resources between communities with different capabilities and needs. The social dynamics of intellectual trade were complex because they required communities to evaluate the relative worth of intangible assets and develop fair exchange mechanisms for resources that couldn't be easily quantified or standardized. The first intellectual commerce wasn't conducted in universities or research institutions, but in practical negotiations between communities seeking to benefit from each other's creative achievements. The psychological aspects of intellectual trade created new forms of professional identity for individuals who specialized in developing, evaluating, or exchanging innovative ideas and techniques. The first knowledge workers weren't modern professionals with advanced degrees, but early human specialists whose expertise lay in managing intellectual rather than physical resources. The emergence of quality control systems for intellectual trade became essential as communities recognized the risks associated with adopting innovations that hadn't been adequately tested or that were inappropriate for local circumstances. The first standards for intellectual commerce weren't formal certification procedures, but practical methods for ensuring that traded innovations would actually provide promised benefits. The development of intellectual security measures represented recognition that valuable innovations could be stolen, misused, or deliberately corrupted by competitors or enemies. The first trade secrets weren't corporate proprietary information, but community knowledge that provided competitive advantages and needed protection from unauthorized access or use. The social implications of intellectual security were significant because they created tensions between the benefits of open knowledge sharing and the need to protect valuable community assets. Communities had to develop policies about what information could be shared freely, what required protection, and how to maintain beneficial relationships with trading partners while safeguarding crucial competitive advantages. The psychological challenges of intellectual security work were intense for individuals responsible for managing sensitive knowledge and making decisions about information sharing. These early information security specialists had to balance community welfare against competitive advantage while maintaining the trust relationships that made intellectual trade possible. The emergence of counterintelligence capabilities represented the darker side of intellectual security as communities developed techniques for protecting themselves against attempts to steal or corrupt their valuable innovations. The first industrial espionage wasn't conducted by corporate spies, but by individuals seeking to gain unauthorized access to innovations that could provide significant advantages to their own communities. The development of defensive measures against intellectual theft required new forms of expertise and resource allocation that went beyond traditional security concerns. communities had to protect not just physical assets, but also intangible knowledge that existed primarily in the minds of specialists or in primitive record-keeping systems. The social dynamics of intellectual defense created new forms of professional specialization and community organization. The first counterintelligence officers weren't formal security professionals, but individuals who specialized in protecting valuable community knowledge while maintaining the openness needed for beneficial intellectual exchange. The psychological pressures on individuals responsible for intellectual security were significant because they had to maintain constant vigilance against threats that were often subtle and difficult to detect. The first information security anxiety wasn't about computer hackers or corporate espionage, but about the possibility that valuable community innovations might be stolen or corrupted by competitors. The emergence of offensive intellectual capabilities represented recognition that communities could gain advantages not just by developing their own innovations, but by disrupting the intellectual development of competitors or enemies. The first intellectual warfare wasn't conducted by government agencies, but by communities seeking to protect themselves by undermining the innovative capabilities of potential threats. The development of techniques for intellectual disruption required specialized knowledge about how innovation systems worked and how they could be sabotaged without detection. The first saboteurs of intellectual development weren't foreign agents, but community members who understood that preventing enemy innovation could be as important as developing friendly capabilities. The social implications of intellectual warfare were profound because they represented a fundamental shift from a competition based primarily on physical capabilities to competition based on cognitive and creative advantages. Communities that could effectively develop, protect, and deploy intellectual weapons had significant advantages over those that relied primarily on traditional forms of conflict. The psychological challenges of intellectual conflict were different from those associated with physical warfare because they required sustained cognitive effort over extended periods rather than intense physical courage during brief confrontations. The first intellectual warriors weren't professional soldiers, but specialists who dedicated their lives to gaining and maintaining cognitive advantages over competitors. The emergence of intellectual alliances represented attempts by communities to combine their creative capabilities against common threats or challenges. The first research partnerships weren't formal institutional arrangements, but practical agreements between allied communities to share intellectual resources and coordinate innovative efforts. These intellectual alliances required new forms of diplomatic skill and international cooperation that went beyond traditional military or economic partnerships. Communities had to develop trust relationships that allowed them to share their most valuable intellectual assets, while maintaining enough independence to protect their own interests. The social dynamics of intellectual cooperation, their need to maintain competitive benefits of collaboration were complex, because they required communities to balance their desire for the advantages over non-allied groups. The first international research agreements weren't formal treaties but practical arrangements for sharing intellectual resources while protecting sensitive information. The psychological challenges of managing intellectual alliances were significant for individuals responsible for maintaining collaborative relationships while protecting community interests. These early diplomatic specialists had to understand both the technical aspects of intellectual cooperation and the political implications of different forms of knowledge sharing. The development of standards for intellectual cooperation became essential as alliances expanded and became more complex. Communities had to agree on common approaches to innovation development, quality control for shared resources, and procedures for resolving disputes about intellectual property rights or resource allocation. The emergence of international intellectual institutions represented attempts to formalize and systematize the cooperative arrangements that had developed through bilateral agreements between allied communities. The first research organisations weren't modern universities or think tanks, but practical arrangements for coordinating intellectual development across multiple communities. The social implications of intellectual institutions were enormous because they created new forms of identity and loyalty that transcended traditional community boundaries. Individuals who participated in international intellectual organizations often developed professional relationships and commitments that were as strong as their ties to their birth communities. The psychological impact of international intellectual work was profound for individuals who had to balance their loyalty to their home communities with their commitments to collaborative projects that served broader human interests. The first international professionals weren't diplomats or business executives, but intellectual workers whose expertise crossed traditional community boundaries. The development of career systems for international intellectual work represented recognition that these collaborative efforts required long-term professional commitments that couldn't be maintained through casual or temporary arrangements. The first international career tracks weren't formal employment programs, but practical pathways for individuals who specialized in cross-community intellectual collaboration. The emergence of intellectual leadership roles within international organizations created new forms of authority that were based on expertise and collaborative skill rather than traditional community status or physical capabilities. The first international intellectual leaders weren't political figures, but specialists who gained influence through their ability to coordinate complex collaborative projects. The social dynamics of intellectual leadership in international contexts were complex because leaders had to maintain the trust and respect of individuals from different communities with varying cultural backgrounds and competing interests. These early international managers had to develop sophisticated diplomatic and communication skills, along with their technical expertise. The psychological challenges of international intellectual leadership were significant because leaders had to make decisions that affected multiple communities while maintaining their own professional integrity and effectiveness. The first international executives weren't corporate managers, but intellectual coordinators, learning to balance competing demands from different stakeholders. The development of accountability systems for international intellectual organizations became essential as these institutions grew in size and importance. Communities that contributed resources to collaborative projects needed assurance that their investments were being used effectively and that the benefits would be distributed fairly among participants. The emergence of evaluation techniques for international intellectual work represented attempts to assess the effectiveness of collaborative efforts and identify areas where improvements were needed. The first international performance reviews weren't formal assessment procedures, but practical methods for determining whether collaborative projects were achieving their intended goals. The social implications of international accountability systems were significant because they created new forms of transparency and democratic participation that extended beyond traditional community governance structures. Communities began demanding representation in decisions about international intellectual projects that affected their interests. The psychological impact of international accountability on intellectual workers was complex because it created both protection against exploitation and pressure to demonstrate measurable results from their collaborative efforts. The first international performance anxiety wasn't about corporate productivity metrics, but about proving that collaborative intellectual work was producing benefits that justified its costs. The development of quality assurance systems for international intellectual organizations represented recognition that collaborative efforts could produce both exceptional results and catastrophic failures depending on how they were managed. Communities needed confidence that international projects would meet minimum standards for effectiveness and reliability. The emergence of standards for international intellectual quality control created new forms of professional expertise focused on evaluating and improving collaborative processes rather than developing specific innovations or solutions. The first international quality control specialists weren't manufacturing inspectors, but intellectual coordinators who specialized in ensuring effective collaboration. The social dynamics of international quality control were challenging because they required specialists to evaluate work produced by individuals from different communities with varying standards and approaches. These early international auditors had to develop cultural sensitivity along with technical expertise to assess collaborative work fairly and effectively. The psychological challenges of international quality control work were significant because specialists had to maintain objectivity while working within collaborative relationships that required trust and mutual respect. The first international critics weren't academic reviewers, but practical evaluators learning to balance supportive collaboration with honest assessment of work quality. The development of conflict resolution systems for international intellectual disputes became crucial as collaborative efforts expanded and disagreements inevitably arose between communities with different priorities and approaches. The first international arbitration wasn't conducted in formal courts with written laws, but through practical negotiations where respected specialists from neutral communities helped resolve disputes about resource allocation, credit for innovations, or the direction of collaborative projects. These early arbitrators faced extraordinary challenges because they had to understand both the technical aspects of intellectual disputes and the cultural sensitivities of communities that might have fundamentally different approaches to problem solving and decision making. The first international mediators weren't professional diplomats, but intellectual workers who had gained the trust and respect of multiple communities through their expertise and fairness. The psychological demands on international arbitrators were intense because they had to make decisions that could affect the survival and prosperity of entire communities while maintaining their reputation for objectivity and wisdom. The first international judges weren't appointed officials, but specialists who voluntarily took on the burden of resolving disputes that could determine the success or failure of crucial collaborative projects. The emergence of precedent systems within international intellectual dispute resolution represented attempts to create consistency and predictability in decisions about collaborative conflicts. The first international legal principles weren't written codes, but practical guidelines that evolved from successful resolution of previous disputes and were remembered and applied by arbitrators facing similar conflicts. The social implications of international dispute resolution were enormous because they created mechanisms for maintaining collaborative relationships, even when serious disagreements arose between participating communities. Without effective conflict resolution systems, valuable collaborative projects might collapse due to relatively minor disputes that could have been resolved through skilled mediation. The development of prevention systems for international intellectual conflicts represented recognition that avoiding disputes was often more effective than resolving them after they had escalated into serious problems. The first international conflict prevention wasn't conducted by peacekeeping forces, but by specialists who monitored collaborative projects for early signs of tension and intervened before disagreements became destructive conflicts. The psychological skills required for international conflict prevention were sophisticated because specialists had to recognize subtle signs of developing tension while maintaining the trust and cooperation of all parties involved in collaborative projects. These early warning specialists had to combine technical understanding of collaborative processes with intuitive awareness of human psychology and group dynamics. The emergence of communication systems specifically designed for international intellectual collaboration represented recognition that effective cooperation information exchange than casual contact or traditional required more sophisticated trading relationships could provide. The first international communication networks weren't technological systems, but coordinated human networks that could rapidly transmit complex information across vast distances. These communication networks required individuals who specialized in managing information flow between communities with different languages, cultural practices, and priorities. The first international communications coordinators weren't professional translators, but intellectual workers who could accurately convey complex technical and social information across cultural boundaries while maintaining the nuances and context that were essential for effective collaboration. The development of translation systems for international intellectual work went far beyond simple language conversion to encompass the challenge of communicating complex ideas between communities that might have fundamentally different approaches to understanding and organizing knowledge. The first international translators weren't just linguists, but cultural interpreters who could bridge conceptual gaps between different intellectual traditions. The social dynamics of international communication were complex because they required communities to develop trust in information that had been filtered through multiple translation and interpretation processes. Communities had to have confidence that the ideas and instructions they received from collaborative partners accurately represented the original intentions and weren't distorted by communication errors or cultural misunderstandings. The psychological challenges of international communication work were significant for individuals responsible for ensuring accurate information transfer between communities whose survival might depend on precise understanding of collaborative agreements and technical specifications. The first international communication anxiety wasn't about telephone or internet reliability, but about the possibility that crucial information might be lost or corrupted during transmission across cultural and linguistic boundaries. The emergence of standardization systems for international intellectual collaboration represented attempts to create common frameworks that could reduce communication errors and increase the efficiency of cooperative projects. The first international standards weren't formal technical specifications, but practical agreements about terminology, measurement systems, and procedural approaches that could be understood and applied consistently across different communities. These standardization efforts required communities to make compromises between their traditional approaches and the common systems needed for effective collaboration. The first international standardization negotiations weren't conducted in formal conferences, but through practical discussions between specialists who had to balance respect for local traditions with the need for collaborative efficiency. The development of training systems for international intellectual standards became essential as these common frameworks became more complex and sophisticated. Communities had to ensure that their specialists could work effectively within international standards, while maintaining their ability to apply these approaches to local conditions and requirements. The social implications of international standardization were profound because they began to create shared intellectual cultures that transcended traditional community boundaries. Individuals who worked extensively within international standards often developed professional identities that were as strong as their community loyalties, leading to new forms of social organization and cultural development. The psychological impact of international standardization on individual specialists was complex because it created both opportunities for enhanced professional effectiveness and anxiety about losing connection to traditional community approaches and values. The first international professionals had to navigate between loyalty to their birth communities and commitment to collaborative standards that might sometimes conflict with local traditions. The emergence of innovation diffusion systems within international intellectual networks allowed beneficial developments to spread rapidly across much larger geographical areas than had ever been possible before. The first international technology transfer wasn't conducted through formal licensing agreements, but through systematic sharing of innovations between allied communities that had agreed to collaborative development arrangements. These diffusion systems required sophisticated understanding of how innovations could be adapted to different local conditions while maintaining their essential effectiveness. The first international technology transfer specialists weren't professional consultants, but intellectual workers who specialized in helping communities modify collaborative innovations to work effectively within their specific circumstances and cultural contexts. The development control systems for international innovation of quality diffusion became crucial as communities recognized that innovations that worked well in one context might fail catastrophically when applied inappropriately in different circumstances. The first international innovation assessment wasn't conducted through formal testing laboratories, but through practical evaluation procedures that could determine when and how innovations should be modified for different applications. The social dynamics of international innovation diffusion were challenging because they required communities to balance their desire for beneficial innovations with their need to maintain cultural identity and social stability. The first international innovation policies weren't written regulations, but practical agreements about how rapidly and extensively communities would adopt collaborative developments. The psychological challenges of managing international innovation adoption were significant for community leaders who had to make decisions about accepting changes that could provide substantial benefits but might also disrupt established social patterns and cultural traditions. The first innovation adoption anxiety wasn't about technological unemployment, but about the possibility that beneficial changes might undermine community cohesion and identity. The emergence of selective adoption systems for international innovations represented recognition that communities could benefit from collaborative developments without accepting every aspect of external approaches. The first customized technology transfer wasn't conducted by professional consultants, but by community specialists who could identify which aspects of collaborative innovations were appropriate for local adoption and which should be modified or rejected. The development of reverse innovation systems allowed communities to contribute their own developments to international collaborative networks while adapting external innovations to their specific needs. The first international innovation exchange wasn't conducted through formal research partnerships, but through practical arrangements where communities shared their unique developments while gaining access to innovations from collaborative partners. The social implications of reverse innovation were enormous because they allowed smaller or more isolated communities to make valuable contributions to international collaborative efforts, rather than simply receiving benefits developed by larger or more advanced partners. This reciprocal relationship helped maintain the equality and mutual respect that were essential for effective long-term collaboration. The psychological impact of reverse innovation opportunities was significant for communities that had previously seen themselves as recipients rather than contributors in international collaborative relationships. The first collaborative self-confidence wasn't about individual achievement, but about community recognition that they could make valuable contributions to projects that benefited much larger human networks. The emergence of innovation coordination systems within international networks represented attempts to prevent duplication of effort, while ensuring that all important areas of development received adequate attention. The first international research coordination wasn't conducted through formal planning agencies, but through practical communication systems that allowed collaborative communities to share information about their development priorities and current projects. These coordination systems required sophisticated understanding of both the technical aspects of different innovation areas and the political dynamics of communities that might have competing interests or priorities. The first international research coordinators weren't professional planners, but intellectual workers who had gained the trust and respect of multiple communities through their expertise and diplomatic skills. The development of resource allocation systems for international collaborative innovation became essential as projects became more complex and required contributions from multiple communities with different capabilities and limitations. The first international project budgeting wasn't conducted through formal financial institutions, but through practical negotiations about how communities would contribute materials, labour, and expertise to collaborative efforts. The social dynamics of international resource allocation were complex because they required communities to make commitments based on uncertain future benefits, while trusting that collaborative partners would fulfill their own obligations, even when circumstances changed or unexpected challenges arose. The first international project trust wasn't established through legal contracts, but through relationships built on demonstrated reliability and mutual benefit. The psychological challenges of international resource commitment were significant for community leaders who had to allocate precious resources toward collaborative projects that might not produce immediate benefits for their own people. The first international investment anxiety wasn't about financial markets, but about the possibility that collaborative commitments might compromise community survival if local circumstances changed unexpectedly. The emergence of risk management systems for international collaborative projects represented recognition that complex cooperative efforts faced many potential sources of failure that couldn't be prevented through careful planning alone. The first international risk assessment wasn't conducted through formal analysis procedures, but through practical evaluation of potential threats to collaborative success and development of contingency plans for addressing various types of problems. These risk management efforts required specialists who could understand both the technical aspects of collaborative projects and the various external factors that might affect their success. The first international risk managers weren't professional consultants, but experienced collaborative workers who had learned through practice how to anticipate and prepare for the challenges that typically arose during complex cooperative efforts. The development of crisis management systems for international collaborative projects became crucial as communities recognized that even well-planned cooperative efforts could face unexpected emergencies that threatened their success or survival. The first international crisis response wasn't conducted by professional emergency management teams, but by collaborative specialists who could rapidly coordinate responses to threats that affected multiple communities simultaneously. The psychological demands on international crisis managers were intense because they had to make rapid decisions under extreme pressure while coordinating responses across multiple communities that might have different priorities and capabilities. The first international crisis leadership wasn't exercised by appointed officials, but by collaborative specialists who emerged naturally during emergencies due to their expertise and ability to maintain effectiveness under stress. The social implications of international crisis management were significant because they demonstrated that collaborative relationships could survive and even be strengthened by successfully overcoming serious challenges together. Communities that had worked together effectively during crises often developed stronger and more trusting relationships that enhanced their ability to pursue even more ambitious collaborative projects. The emergence of recovery systems for international collaborative projects represented recognition that even successful crisis management might not be sufficient to restore projects to their original effectiveness without systematic efforts to address the damage caused by emergencies. The first international recovery planning wasn't conducted through formal reconstruction programs, but through practical efforts to rebuild collaborative capabilities and relationships after they had been disrupted by crises. The development of resilient systems for international collaborative networks represented attempts to create collaborative arrangements that could continue functioning effectively even when individual communities or projects faced serious challenges. The first international redundancy planning wasn't conducted through formal backup systems, but through practical arrangements that ensured essential collaborative functions could be maintained, even when some participants were unable to fulfill their normal roles. The psychological aspects of resilience planning were complex because they required communities to prepare for potential failures while maintaining the optimism and commitment needed for successful collaboration. The first international contingency thinking wasn't about military preparedness, but about maintaining collaborative effectiveness under adverse conditions while continuing to pursue ambitious cooperative goals. The social dynamics of resilient systems were challenging because they required communities to make commitments to support collaborative partners during their times of difficulty, even when such support might strain their own resources or capabilities. The first international mutual aid agreements weren't formal treaties, but practical arrangements based on recognition that collaborative success required all participants to remain viable and effective. The emergence of adaptation systems for international collaborative networks represented recognition that successful cooperation required continuous adjustment to changing circumstances rather than rigid adherence to original plans and agreements. The first international flexibility planning wasn't conducted through formal change management procedures, but through practical approaches that allowed collaborative arrangements to evolve while maintaining their essential effectiveness and purpose. These adaptation systems required sophisticated understanding of both the core principles that were essential to collaborative success and the specific details that could be modified without undermining overall effectiveness. The first international change managers weren't professional consultants, but collaborative specialists who had developed the expertise needed to guide evolution of cooperative arrangements while preserving their fundamental strengths. The development of learning systems within international collaborative networks allowed communities to improve their cooperative effectiveness through systematic analysis of both successful and unsuccessful collaborative experiences. The first international lessons learned programs weren't formal educational curricula, but practical approaches to extracting valuable insights from collaborative projects and sharing these insights with other communities pursuing similar cooperative efforts. The social implications of collaborative learning systems were enormous because they allowed human communities to accelerate their development through shared experience rather than requiring each group to learn through individual trial and error. Communities that participated effectively in collaborative learning networks could avoid many of the mistakes that had hindered previous cooperative efforts, while building on the successes achieved by other collaborative partnerships. The psychological impact of collaborative learning opportunities was significant for individuals who gained access to knowledge and insights that had been developed through experiences they could never have had individually. The first international professional development wasn't about career advancement, but about gaining the expertise needed to contribute effectively to collaborative efforts that address challenges beyond the capabilities of individual communities. The emergence of mentorship systems within international collaborative networks created new forms of professional relationship that transcended traditional community boundaries and cultural differences. The first international mentors weren't formal teachers, but experienced collaborative specialists who took responsibility for developing the capabilities of less experienced individuals from different communities and cultural backgrounds. These mentorship relationships required sophisticated cross-cultural communication skills and deep understanding of how different communities approach learning and professional development. The first international mentors had to balance respect for diverse cultural traditions with the need to develop common, collaborative capabilities that would enable effective cooperation across community boundaries. The development of expertise exchange systems within international networks allowed communities to share specialized knowledge that had been developed for local applications but could benefit collaborative partners working on similar challenges. The first international consulting wasn't conducted by professional service firms, but through practical arrangements where communities provided technical assistance to collaborative partners in exchange for access to different forms of specialized expertise. The social dynamics of expertise exchange were complex because they required communities to share knowledge that might provide competitive advantages, while trusting that collaborative partners would reciprocate with equally valuable contributions. The first international knowledge markets weren't formal commercial arrangements, but practical systems for exchanging intellectual resources based on mutual benefit and long-term collaborative relationships. The psychological challenges of international expertise sharing were significant for specialists who had to balance their loyalty to their home communities with their commitment to collaborative success. The first international professional ethics weren't formal codes of conduct, but practical guidelines that emerged from the need to maintain both individual integrity and collaborative effectiveness while working across community boundaries. The emergence of professional identity systems within international collaborative networks created new forms of personal and social identity that complemented rather than replaced traditional community loyalties. The first international professional communities weren't formal organizations, but informal networks of individuals who shared common expertise and collaborative commitments across traditional cultural and geographical boundaries. These professional identity systems allowed individuals to maintain strong connections to their birth communities, while also developing meaningful relationships with collaborative partners who shared their specialized interests and expertise. The first international professionals weren't diplomats or business executives, but technical specialists whose work required them to function effectively within both local community contexts and international collaborative frameworks. The development of career development systems for international collaborative work represented recognition that effective cooperation required individuals who could dedicate significant portions of their lives to developing and maintaining the specialized capabilities needed for complex international projects. The first international career planning wasn't about corporate advancement, but about developing the expertise needed to contribute effectively to collaborative efforts throughout a working lifetime. The social implications of international career systems were profound because they created new pathways for individual achievement and recognition that weren't dependent on traditional community status systems. Individuals who developed exceptional collaborative capabilities could gain respect and influence within international networks, even if their contributions weren't fully recognized within their home communities. The psychological aspects of international career development were complex because they required individuals to balance their personal ambitions with their commitments to both local communities and international collaborative efforts. The first international career anxiety wasn't about job security or income, but about maintaining personal effectiveness and professional relationships across multiple communities and cultural contexts simultaneously. The emergence of succession planning systems represented recognition that effective cooperation, international collaborative leadership, required continuity of expertise and relationships that couldn't be maintained through casual or temporary arrangements. The first international succession planning wasn't conducted through formal human resource procedures, but through practical efforts to ensure that essential collaborative functions could continue even when key individuals were no longer able to fulfill their roles. These succession systems required sophisticated understanding of both the technical expertise and the relationship-building capabilities that were essential for international collaborative leadership. The first international leadership development wasn't conducted through formal training programs, but through practical mentorship and experience-sharing arrangements that prepared individuals to assume collaborative leadership responsibilities. The development of knowledge preservation systems for international collaborative networks became essential, as these cooperative arrangements accumulated valuable experience and expertise that needed to be maintained across generations of participants. The first international knowledge management wasn't conducted through formal information systems, but through practical approaches to documenting and transmitting the insights and capabilities that had been developed through collaborative experience. The social dynamics of international knowledge preservation were challenging because they required communities to balance their desire to protect valuable intellectual assets with their need to share knowledge for collaborative success. The first international intellectual property policies weren't formal legal frameworks, but practical agreements about how knowledge developed through collaborative efforts would be preserved, shared, and protected. The psychological impact of knowledge preservation responsibilities was significant for individuals who had to balance their commitment to collaborative success with their obligations to protect their community's interests and intellectual assets. The first international knowledge stewards weren't professional librarians, but collaborative specialists who took responsibility for maintaining and protecting valuable intellectual resources while ensuring they remained accessible for legitimate collaborative purposes. And so we reach the end of our journey through the minds and lives of our earliest ancestors, those remarkable beings who faced an untamed world with nothing but raw intelligence and unshakable determination. From their first tentative steps on the African savanna to the complex collaborative networks that would eventually span continents, these first humans weren't just surviving, they were inventing what it meant to be human. Every challenge they faced, from learning which plants were safe to eat to developing the first systems of international cooperation, required them to push beyond the boundaries of what any species had ever achieved. They didn't have the luxury of learning from textbooks or following established procedures. They had to create knowledge from nothing, build trust without guarantees, and make decisions that would echo through thousands of generations. What strikes me most about their story is how familiar their struggles remain today. The tension between individual needs and collective welfare, the challenge of balancing innovation with tradition, the difficulty of maintaining cooperation across cultural boundaries. These weren't just ancient problems, they were the birth pangs of every issue we still grapple with as a species. These first humans gave us more than just survival techniques and primitive technologies. They gave us the template for human civilization itself, the capacity to learn from each other, to build on previous discoveries, to cooperate across vast distances and cultural differences. Every collaborative project, every international agreement, every moment when humans choose to work together rather than compete, traces back to those first courageous decisions made by people whose names we'll never know, but whose legacy lives in every breath we take. Next time, we'll explore how these foundational human capabilities evolved and spread, transforming small bands of survivors into the global civilization that would eventually reach for the stars. But that's a story for another night. For now, let the incredible journey of our earliest ancestors remind you that every human achievement, no matter how grand or seemingly impossible, began with someone brave enough to try something that had never been done before.